as one very florid press release said, as I recall, that if Northern Pulp closed in 2 weeks, everybody else would shut down as well. Clearly, that hasn't happened. So mid 2000s, industry is using, not just the paper mills, but the whole sector is using about 6 million cubic meters of wood annually, and changes, many different kinds of changes, declines in numbers of sawmills, declines in pulp production, and on, got us down to about 2.5 million cubic meters by 2020. The 2020 figure probably was also affected by COVID, but I don't think any of us knows really what the full extent of the COVID impact was, to be honest with you. And the 3 pulp mills, which are now down to 1, once provided about 2,000 jobs. However, currently, according to the Port Hawkesbury paper site, they have 325 workers at the 1 remaining mill in the province. So over that 50 years, Nova Scotia really embraced a widespread model of industrial forest management. The percentage of wood harvested by clear cutting rose until it reached some 80, and in some reports 90% of the harvesting practices in the province were done that way. The focus was on growing small diameter softwood trees, which gave enough to the sawmills to have some small dimensional lumber, and then provided a lot of quote unquote waste, which became wood chips for the pulp mills. And that was the model. During that time, a generous person would have to say that forest policy ignored the long-term impacts of management on future options for the forest. Now, there were very good owners across the province, some of whom I agree with and some of whom I don't, but who chose to think about the long-term value of their assets and how to preserve not only economic, but ecological and social values. They were, however, in the great minority. Forest policy pretty much ignored the future economic, ecological, and social values that might come out of our forests in favor of a fairly tight focus on what we could get now for the mills that we had that currently operating. In 2017, I guess it was, former Premier McNeil asked Bill Leahy, who was the the president of King's College in Halifax, to do an independent review of forest practices in Nova Scotia, and Leahy did a corker, to be honest with you. He came out forcefully against the long-term single-minded focus on short-term economics that had occupied Nova Scotia for several decades at that point. And he said, it's really quite important. My conclusion is that environmental, social, and economic values should be balanced by using forest practices that give priority to protecting and enhancing ecosystems and biodiversity. Going on to say ecosystems and biodiversity are the foundation on which the other values, including the economic ones, ultimately depend. It was something that our association, Nova Scotia Woodland Owners and Operators Association, had been saying for more than 30 years at that point. To be honest, we were viewed skeptically, with anger perhaps in the beginning, and then with scorn and derision, and described as kooks and so forth for the longest time. So it was with some pleasure, I think, that our members saw the Leahy report and the conclusions, which in fact had been well supported in science for many, many years before Leahy put them all together in a report about Nova Scotia's practices. The pulp era was also hard on landowners, frankly. As you may know, there are 33,000-ish family forest owners. That number is really hard to come by, and just it's worth you'd think it would be easy, right? But it's worth a short detour to say that, as a landowner, I might own one parcel in my name and one in the name of myself and my wife. and one that I might own with a grandchild or a child, and there might be one in a corporate name. And so actually determining how many family forest owners or forest owners at all in Nova Scotia there are is a near impossible task. But we do a mailing every year to people who we think are new purchasers of forest land. And the way that the registry of deeds is set up, not all of them are, but we get it about 92% right based on the tests that we do. And that amounts to about 1,600 parcels per year that change hands. And we also know that forest landowners are in general 55 and older, so the tenure is probably 20 to 25 years, and that gives us a figure of around 30 to 40,000 parcels. So assuming that they're all turning over at the end of the owner's life, and so that's probably a good number in there. The bottom line is that small private landowners, or private landowners generally, own 52% of the forest and 60% of the wood in Nova Scotia. And so the industry really depends on them in order to survive. That was underscored by Woodbridge Associates in 2011, which was commissioned by I guess it was still the Department of Natural Resources then. Hard to keep track these days, but anyway, Woodbridge Associates noted that landowner participation in the forest economy peaked in 1997, and just 13 years later, 33% of those people who were selling wood in 1997 were no longer willing to engage in commercial harvesting. That's a shocking decline, a very, very shocking decline, and but actually fairly understandable, because for 4 decades, studies of forest stewards in Nova Scotia, across Canada, and across the industrialized world had shown that most landowners were moving away from placing a high emphasis on economic returns and putting more priority on things like solitude and wildlife habitat and firewood production for their own home and a different kind of lifestyle and a place for their kids to recreate and to build a family legacy. I did a thesis at Dow that wrapped up in 2017, in which I went out with a number of forest landowners, and we talked about why they own their lands. And this concept of legacy became really, really important. I did it by walking in the woods with the landowners who wore recorders and who talked. And basically, my initial question was, tell me about this land. And the follow-up questions were only meant to amplify points that people raised. And so it was a qualitative study, not a survey. And it was, and I brought all of this text back, 37 landowners, most of a million words. Gosh, I'm forgetting already, and that's a good thing. Anyway, it was a lot of work, and analyze the text in ways that are consistent with qualitative analysis. And the issue of legacy really became the unifying theme. Not that all landowners had the same values or priorities. They do not, absolutely do not. But that most landowners, or in fact, every landowner that I interviewed, referred to in a very important way values that were related not to the current time, but to a future goal or priority, right? It might be that they wanted retirement income or to pass an asset to a child. It might be that they were concerned about the supply of wood products to a future Nova Scotia, or wildlife habitat going down the road to species that live in the forest, and so forth. There were many, many, many different conceptions of legacy, but this idea that woodlands are mostly held for their future contributions that they can make to individuals and to society was a really strong outcome of that study, and I'm rather proud of that work. It was the first time that the legacy concept was really sharply identified, I think, as a motivator. And it was really kind of important. Another side digression perhaps, kind of important in policy, right? And probably important to the mills as well, because if our policies or our mill purchasing activities are all built around providing cash to landowners in the short term, and their goals are all about the long term, well, our likelihood of success is significantly diminished. So keep that in mind. Maybe we'll get back to that later. So significant impact then of the pulp orientation on the willingness of landowners to participate, because the short-term cash incentive for many landowners was not really why they owned land. Important, really important point. Meanwhile, from the government side, hundreds of millions of tax dollars were flowing to the pulp mills, to managing woodlands in order to create a pulp economy, a pulp plantation, really. This in turn spawned significant and growing public concerns about forest management practices, impacts on wildlife, and so forth, and a pushback amongst folks who had a financial stake in the current system, in suggesting that those things were also needed to be offset by the current values we're receiving. So, you don't need me to tell you that the last 10 or 15 years have been difficult politically for the forest issue in Nova Scotia. It's been contentious and frankly getting more so. What do we know about what Bill Leahy said was the alternative to the path we were on? Leahy basically said, summing up everything he said, basing forest management on natural disturbance regimes, so how trees normally grew and died in the natural forest without human intervention, as being a valuable way to model our own forest practices. He said really that was a way to think about this that would likely minimize unintended consequences of forest management, while also allowing for economic and other values to be captured by humans. So what do we know about ecological forestry? Well, we actually know a whole lot. This is not something that developed overnight. In fact, Murray Prest, who was, I believe, at one time a president of Forest Nova Scotia, wasn't though by 1983 when he filed a brief with the Royal Commission on Forestry, in which he said basically the same thing that Bill Leahy did almost 40 years later. So the science of ecological forestry is well developed. Since the early 90s, really, there have been scores of articles looking at aspects of the ecological forestry question. Important for us in Nova Scotia, however, are just a few key assertions, facts that come out of research studies. So a gap is when a tree is cut, dies, or whatever, creates an opening in the forest. In the pre-settlement Wabanaki Acadian forest, the average gap size, was no larger than 1/10 of an hectare, right? 1/4 of an acre. That was the average gap size. That means that large-scale forest disturbances were very rare. And so that made fire, windstorms, disease outbreaks, and so forth relatively rare on the landscape. In fact, fire in the pre-settlement forest was estimated to be once on the piece of ground you're sitting in right now looking at this screen, on average in the pre-settlement forest would have burned once every 900 to 3,000 years. So that's on the order of 4 to 12 or 13 lifetimes of trees. So fire was really not an issue in the pre-settlement forest. And so with many of those other things, mostly the Acadian forest, which is a wet and relatively fertile in its natural state. Most of the disturbances that occurred were individual trees dying, and perhaps in the process of falling out, maybe knocking over some trees that grew nearby.